For an update on efforts to secure our elections, we're joined now by CBS News election law contributor David Becker, the founder of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd, who is a top counterterrorism official at the Department of Homeland Security. Good to have you both here. I want to start with you, David. We talked last week and we'll continue to talk about election security and integrity. And we know that top officials have testified to Congress that election infrastructure has never been more secure. But there are a lot of buts in this environment we're going into. One specific example, Republican activists in at least 3 states now, where Donald Trump tried to reverse his defeat in 2020, nearly all of them under criminal indictment, are now poised to reprise a role in the upcoming election as presidential electors. This is all Washington Post reporting. What does that mean for the integrity of the events they are directly going to be involved with?
Yeah, as you noted, the 2020 election was an incredible success with regard to election security. Higher turnout than we've ever seen before, in the middle of a global pandemic, and that work has withstood the highest scrutiny we've ever seen in any election for now over 3.5 years.
Not a single challenges.
Yeah, exactly. No evidence in any court of any problem. And yet we remember going back to Detroit in 2020, attacks on counting centers. There were efforts to organize fake electors, which are being litigated, and criminal charges have been brought in many states. There were efforts to fail to certify elections, to give legal effect to elections in places like Arizona and New Mexico, and just earlier this month in Michigan. And it is likely that we will see efforts like that by supporters of losing candidates in November of 2020 and afterwards. That's troubling. These are legal duties that people have to certify elections, particularly when legal challenges have not been successful. But that said, I think election officials all over the country are ready for that in many ways, just like they were in elections since 2020. They were ready for it in Arizona when it happened, in New Mexico when it happened, and just earlier this month in Michigan, election officials in the state quickly required that county to act and certify the elections. So we will expect that there will be efforts to slow down, delay, or even attack the counting, auditing, and certification process, perhaps, in the last 2 months of 2024. Yeah. But I'm cautiously optimistic that election officials are ready to keep that moving on track so that electors can be ascertained on December 11th, meet on December 17th, and be counted on January 6th.
So, Sam, you were in the administration until recently. Spreading lies about candidates is not illegal. It is protected free speech. But what David's talking about poses a threat at the state level, and it's states that run these elections. How concerned are you, and whose job is it to set the record straight?
Well, Margaret, just because speech is protected by the First Amendment does not mean that it's cost-free. We know that in today's threat environment, disinformation is unfortunately becoming the norm rather than the exception when it comes to election security. And it's having a direct impact. We know that there's been an unprecedented level of physical threats arising out of election-related disinformation. January 6th is just one example. The Department of Justice's Election Threats Task Force has made 17 arrests, 13 convictions in their ongoing investigations. And when election-related disinformation spreads, every American needs to understand that does give a benefit to our adversaries, Russia and China, who want to sow discord and undermine our democratic processes. Americans should be confident in our election infrastructure security, but our information ecosystem remains incredibly vulnerable. And the federal government is not and should not be the omnipresent fact checker for the American people. The federal government is undergoing rigorous processes to debunk specific inaccurate information about elections, as are state and local state board of elections. At the same time, social media companies should be thinking about what kinds of election disinformation violate their terms of service. And every American, frankly, has a patriotic duty to engage in additional security checks when it comes to the information that they are digesting and sharing. Americans lock their doors, we wear our seatbelts, we take security precautions in other domains, and we need to apply that same rigor to our information ecosystem for our national security and physical security as well.
No, we put a lot on the electorate to keep themselves informed, and certainly here we will try to be fact-checking, but there is so much disinformation. misinformation sometimes, but a lot of it's deliberate. I want to ask you, David. Speaker Johnson told reporters earlier this week he knew intuitively that non-U.S. citizens had been voting in the elections. He said it's not easily proven, but he issued a statement saying Russian spies, Chinese diplomats, and illegal aliens are influencing the election. How does an election official certify that someone is a U.S. citizen when they come to vote?
There are multiple protections around this. First, it is against the law. There is a federal statute, 18 U.S. Code, Section 611, that says it's unlawful, up to a year in jail, and fines for a non-citizen that votes. In addition, under the Help America Vote Act, which has been in place for over 2 decades, every single registered voter needs to provide ID before registering. And that ID is almost always a driver's license number, which is checked against the motor vehicles file. And when you go to motor vehicles, you know you need to show legal presence. Most people show a birth certificate from the United States or a passport, which shows that they're citizens. That can be checked against that.
If they don't have that.
If they don't have that, they can provide a social security number, which is also checked, or they have to provide ID at the polls before they vote. So there's absolute ID for voter registration. And we know these two protections have been enormously successful because this is knowable, despite what the speaker might have said. Georgia, for instance, ran an audit of their entire voter registration system. They found about 1,500 people that they couldn't confirm whether they were citizens or not, and determined that literally 0 of them had voted. Same with other states have done similar things. The data is all in the state databases. They can check it. We can be very confident that voting by non-citizens is extremely rare, virtually non-existent. Not 0 probably, but very close to 0.
Sam, how much planning is the federal government doing going into this election when we know there may be perhaps even violent disagreement?
Well, I do want to emphasize it's not just the federal government. Federal, state, and local officials are engaged in a range of contingency planning for various threat scenarios, whether that be deepfake circulating that could impact voter suppression, for example. We saw attempts at that in New Hampshire, or whether it's actual physical security incidents coming out of election results. The federal government, with its state and local partners, is engaged in contingency planning for physical security threats and other threats that could impact the elections and its aftermath.